Opening the center immediately creates dynamic possibilities, pressuring black's pawn structure and demanding a response. Creating a solid pawn chain, black prepares to challenge white's central pawn and potentially open lines later. Asserting central dominion, d4 immediately contests space and prepares for pawn advances. Challenging the center directly sets up a dynamic pawn battle. Opening the center with the pawn exchange grants freedom for your pieces to develop actively. Reclaiming the center with the pawn establishes symmetry and opens a vital diagonal for your queen. Challenging the pawn chain immediately opens lines for queenside pressure. Developing the knight now stakes a claim in the center, challenging white's ambitious pawn thrust and opening lines for his other pieces. This move boldly contests central space, preparing to develop the bishop and potentially eye the kingside. Solidifying the center and preparing development, this maneuver gently relinquishes central space for a robust pawn structure. Developing a knight efficiently reinforces the central pawn structure and prepares for castling. Developing the bishop harmonizes with the pawn structure, preparing for castling and solidifying central influence. Developing the bishop to pressure the knight, this move aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and control central squares. Safeguarding your monarch is paramount now, preparing for the upcoming pawn advances and potential central skirmishes. Pining the knight opens up possibilities for attacking the queenside pawn structure. Developing the knight to c6 solidifies black's central presence and prepares to contest the d4 square, a crucial battleground in this variation. Pushing the pawn forward now isolates black's knight and seizes space, creating potential weaknesses for the opponent. A bold centralization, challenging white's central pawn structure and preparing piece activity. Simplifying the pawn structure clears out some positional clutter and prepares for a more active rook on the open d-file. Reclaiming the pawn with the queen reestablishes material balance and prepares to contest central space. Developing the bishop to a more active square prepares for castling and supports potential central pawn advances. Developing the bishop to this diagonal readies it for potential queen support or pressure along that long open line. This move prepares to expand on the queen side, potentially opening lines for future pawn advances and controlling more space. Pushing the f-pawn boldly opens lines, potentially freeing the king but risking a weakened structure for the monarch. Securing the queenside's central presence, this bishop maneuver aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances. Activating the knight to the kingside creates immediate pressure and forces white to reconsider their pawn structure and piece development. Shattering black's pawn structure opens lines, though it also gifts their king safer squares. This knight sacrifice unravels white's pawn structure, potentially opening lines toward their king. Recapturing the knight with the queen unifies the queenside pawns and prepares for pawn breaks, but opens lines that black might exploit. Opening the b-file immediately offers black counterplay against white's queen. Focusing the queen on the queenside opens potential for attacking the isolated c-pawn and creating queenside pressure. Securing the king's defense and preparing for potential pawn advances forms the strategic core of this maneuver. Casting kingside offers a crucial safety net, anticipating potential central breakthroughs and fortifying the monarch against upcoming skirmishes. Shattering the central pawn structure creates immediate complications and opens lines toward the king. Seizing the central pawn, white initiates a tactical skirmish with immediate material gain, but risks exposing their own king. Exchanging queens simplifies into an endgame where black's pawn structure is compromised, but white's king lacks defensive cover. Opening the d-file now creates opportunities for white's rook to join the attack on black's somewhat exposed king. Recapturing the pawn frees the rook, opening critical lines for counterplay and asserting black's presence on the e-file. Reinforcing the center pawn aims to restrict black's rook mobility and build a solid pawn structure. The rook repositions, seeking central influence and a more active role on the 7th rank. Reasserting control of the central files, this move begins a positional struggle for dominance. Repositioning the rook to the open file aims to challenge white's central pawn and prepare for pawn structure manipulation. Simplifying the material, white aims to leverage the open central files with his rooks. Finally, pieces are being exchanged, simplifying the game and leading towards a potential endgame. Securing the monarch's safety is paramount as the queens depart, transitioning towards an endgame where king activity becomes crucial. The king ventures out, seeking active participation in the endgame's unfolding drama. Asserting control over the central file is paramount for white, especially with both kings exposed. Shifting the rook to the open file prepares for potential pawn breaks and better king safety. Repositioning the rook to a more active file now begins the fight for central influence and potential breakthroughs. Securing the king's shelter, h6 prevents potential knight incursions into the g4 square, offering a subtle defensive reinforcement. Repositioning the rook allows it to potentially eye the central files and support pawn advances, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive king position. Seeking active counterplay, black aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and prepare for a more dynamic middle game struggle. Shifting the king towards the center initiates a strategic repositioning, preparing for a potential endgame battle. Seeking active rook play, this squares the pieces for a potential breakthrough on the queen side. The monarch ventures into the fray, aiming to bolster the king's pawn structure and participate in the pawn race. Shifting the monarch towards the center, aiming to activate it as the endgame beckons. Knight ventures to the queen side, preparing to contest the file and potentially support a pawn push. Repositioning the rook to the open file offers crucial endgame potential and prepares for eventual pawn breakthroughs. Expanding on the queen side, this pawn launch intends to gain space and create potential attacking avenues. Aggressively challenging the center, this pawn thrust opens lines but potentially weakens your king's shield. Anchoring your pawns here might restrict king activity later. Unleashing the pawn chain's power by opening the g-file for an aggressive pawn storm. Opening the g-file grants immediate kingside pressure, seeking to exploit the doubled pawns. Probing for pawn breaks, this advance aims to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic play on the queen side. Repositioning the knight to c3 aims to bolster the central pawn structure and potentially launch an attack on the queen side. Initiating a queenside pawn storm now aims to disrupt white's structure and create counterplay before the king becomes too exposed. Securing the queenside pawn chain against further advances or infiltrations provides white a stable foundation. Unleashing a knight to the king's flank is a bold attempt to disrupt white's well-fortified pawn structure and create mating threats. Securing the open file with the rook aims to restrict black's king and potentially initiate a queenside advance. Activating the bishop to a more central square enhances its influence over the queenside and supports a potential pawn push. Clearing the way for the knight, this pawn push aims to seize central space and disrupt black's rook activity. Opening the file promises activity, but sacrifices structural integrity. Capturing the pawn opens a critical file for the rook, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Unlocking the c-file opens lines for your rook and activates dormant potential against white's isolated pawn. Claiming open files and eliminating black's counterplay, this knight repositioning seeks to exploit the now vulnerable d-pawn and create decisive pressure. Pivoting the rook to the central file aims to disrupt white's pawns and activate a dormant piece. Reasserting central control with the knight aims to disrupt black's pawn advances and open avenues for counterplay. Repositioning the king to a more active square, potentially aiming for central influence or defensive support. Activating the rook aims to exploit the open file and pressure black's weakened kingside pawns. The rook's repositioning to the f-file activates it, aiming to pressure white's king and potentially create mating threats or exchange opportunities. Rerouting the knight to a more active square, potentially aiming for d4 to contest the central pawn structure. a desperate attempt to create counterplay, but it leaves the rook exposed and doesn't address the immediate threats. Activating the king to participate in the endgame is a sound decision, unleashing the passed pawn's potential to disrupt white's pieces. The king boldly steps into the fray, actively participating in the middle game's unfolding chaos. King's march begins, seeking active squares to support the pawn majority. Centralizing the knight creates a strong outpost and threatens to outmaneuver the black pieces. Pushing the king forward like this exposes it to potential checks from the rook along the open files. Activating the rook to its 7th rank aims to pressure black's pawn structure and potentially create discovered threats. Exchanging off the rook simplifies into a king and pawn endgame where black's king is actively positioned. Clearing a path for the knight to potentially contest the open file and support the pawn majority. Unleashing the king's last defense, venturing into a potentially exposed yet active position. Activating the monarch is paramount in this simplified structure. The king becomes an attacking piece. Bringing the bishop back to its diagonal after the exchange simplifies the position favorably, preparing to contest the open files. The knight leaps into the center, eyeing weaknesses and preparing for a potential pawn advance. Unleashing the king's advanced pawn shield grants the monarch surprising mobility and initiative. Seizing the pawn simplifies the endgame considerably, opening lines for your king. Activating the bishop to a more active diagonal and eyeing the d4 pawn offers counterplay opportunities. The knight's return to g7 aims to disrupt black's exposed king by creating potential attacking lines. Activating the bishop along this diagonal is a prudent step towards disrupting white's advancing pawn structure. Aggressively pushing the pawn creates a passed threat, seeking to outflank black's anchored bishop. Embracing the attack, black's king boldly advances into the fray, seeking active participation. Unleashing a knight fork, this move exploits the exposed black king's precarious position.